Tonight we begin with the peculiar world of ancient Greek superstitions, those curious beliefs that once governed the daily lives of the very people who gave us philosophy, democracy, and theatre. Here we'll discover how the same minds that questioned the nature of reality also spat 3 times to ward off evil spirits, and how the civilization that built the Parthenon lived in constant fear of jealous gods and wandering ghosts. So, before you settle in for the evening, take a moment to consider how these ancient anxieties might not be so different from our own modern quirks. We still knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, and carry lucky charms, proving that some human behaviors transcend centuries. Now dim those lights. Perhaps let the gentle hum of a fan provide that familiar background comfort. And let's drift into the strange and surprisingly familiar world of ancient Greek superstitions. The ancient Greeks lived in a world where invisible forces lurked behind every corner, where speaking carelessly could summon vengeful spirits, and where a simple sneeze required immediate supernatural intervention. These weren't primitive people cowering in ignorance, mind you. These were the intellectuals of the ancient world, the philosophers who gave us logic and reason, yet they carried pouches of protective herbs and whispered prayers before leaving their homes each morning. Take the simple act of naming the dead. To us, mentioning someone who has passed might bring a moment of sadness or fond remembrance. To the ancient Greeks, it was a potentially catastrophic mistake that could drag a restless spirit back into the world of the living. The dead, you see, weren't resting peacefully in some distant afterlife. They lingered as shades, psyche that hovered at the boundaries between worlds, listening, waiting for any mention that might pull them back into mortal affairs. This wasn't mere superstition born of ignorance. The Greeks had a sophisticated understanding of death and the afterlife, complete with detailed mythologies about the underworld, the river Styx, and the ferryman Charon. But this very sophistication made them more anxious, not less. They knew exactly what could go wrong when dealing with the supernatural, and they had precise rules for avoiding disaster. If you absolutely had to refer to someone who had died, especially someone who met a violent or tragic end, you didn't use their name directly. Instead, you employed careful euphemisms. The deceased became the unfortunate one, he who passed beyond, or the one who walks with shadows. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were spiritual safety measures, linguistic shields designed to keep the dead where they belonged. And if you accidentally spoke a name you shouldn't have, well, that's where the spitting came in. Not a crude expectoration, but a ritual gesture. 3 precise spits directed into the air, each one designed to confuse and repel any malevolent forces that might have been attracted by your careless words. This wasn't random folk magic either. The number 3 held deep significance in Greek cosmology, representing completeness and divine power. 3 spits weren't just traditional, they were mathematically and spiritually correct. But names were just the beginning of Greek supernatural anxiety. The evil eye, or Vasconia, represented perhaps their deepest fear. The idea that envy itself could manifest as a tangible, destructive force. This wasn't about obvious curses or dramatic magical rituals. The evil eye was subtle, almost accidental, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Picture this common scenario. You're a proud parent in ancient Athens, and your neighbor compliments your child's rosy cheeks and bright eyes. "What a beautiful, healthy boy," they say, with what seems like genuine admiration. But in that moment of praise, you feel a chill of terror. Not because you suspect ill intent, but because you know that admiration itself, even well-meaning admiration, could attract the jealous attention of supernatural forces. The gods, you see, didn't appreciate mortals who seemed too fortunate, too blessed, too content. Compliments drew attention to good fortune, and attention from divine powers was rarely beneficial. A child praised for health might suddenly fall ill. A farmer whose crops were admired might watch them wither. A merchant complimented on his prosperity might find his ship sinking in calm seas. This fear wasn't paranoia, it was practical theology. The Greeks understood their gods as jealous, petty beings who demanded constant vigilance from mortals. Zeus might hurl thunderbolts at those who grew too proud. Athena could curse someone who claimed to match her wisdom. Apollo might send plague to a city that boasted too loudly of its achievements. In this context, compliments weren't kindness, they were potential death sentences. So how did you protect your family from well-meaning praise? Blue-eyed amulets were the most popular defense, small charms worn around the neck or sewn into clothing. The bright blue eyes, usually made from glass or painted clay, were thought to stare back at any envious gaze, reflecting the evil back to its source. Babies wore these constantly, tiny protective talismans that followed them from birth through childhood. Red strings tied around wrists or ankles served a similar purpose, the colour believed to deflect negative energy and confuse malevolent spirits. Some families hung strings of garlic or onions outside their homes, not for cooking, but for spiritual protection. The strong scents were thought to mask the good fortune within, making the household less noticeable to jealous supernatural forces. And then there was the spitting. Always the spitting. If someone complimented your child, your crops, your health, or your fortune, the proper response wasn't a simple thank you. First came the ritual expectoration. 3 quick spits to neutralize any unintended curse embedded in the praise. Only then could you graciously acknowledge the compliment, secure in the knowledge that you'd taken proper spiritual precautions. Even the architecture of Greek homes reflected these supernatural concerns. Doors were often painted red, not for aesthetic reasons, but because the colour was believed to repel evil spirits. The threshold itself was considered a vulnerable point, where the spiritual and physical worlds intersected, requiring special protection. Knocking 3 times before entering someone else's home wasn't mere politeness. It was a spiritual announcement that gave any resident spirits time to retreat or prepare for visitors. The colour symbolism extended throughout daily life. White clothing was avoided during certain times of year when spirits were believed to be most active, as the pale colour might attract unwanted supernatural attention. Black was reserved for specific rituals and mourning periods, while earth tones were considered safest for everyday wear. Even jewellery choices carried spiritual weight, with silver preferred over gold for its associations with the moon and protective feminine deities. Business transactions required their own supernatural safeguards. Merchants would scatter salt around their stalls, not to season food, but to create protective barriers against envious competitors or customers who might curse their goods. Coins were often marked with tiny protective symbols, and some traders carried small vials of oil blessed by priests, ready to anoint their hands before important negotiations. The Greeks also lived in constant awareness of household spirits, invisible beings that inhabited every home and demanded regular attention. These weren't malevolent presences, but they weren't entirely benevolent either. They were supernatural neighbours who could make life pleasant or miserable depending on how well they were treated. Every home had its sacred corners where small offerings were left daily. Tiny portions of bread, drops of wine, or pinches of honey meant to keep the household spirits content. Forgetting these offerings could result in broken pottery, spoiled food, or general domestic chaos. The spirits weren't vindictive exactly, but they were easily offended and had very specific expectations about proper household management. Cleaning rituals carried spiritual as well as practical significance. Sweeping wasn't just about removing dirt, it was about clearing away negative energy that might have accumulated during the day. The direction of sweeping mattered, always moving from the interior of the home toward the threshold, symbolically pushing out any harmful influences that might have crept inside. Certain household tasks were timed according to spiritual calendars. Laundry wasn't done on days when the dead were believed to be restless, as wet clothes hanging outside might provide temporary bodies for wandering spirits. Bread baking required special attention to timing and ingredients, with protective herbs kneaded into the dough during spiritually vulnerable periods. Even something as simple as lighting lamps at sunset carried supernatural significance. The transition from day to night was considered a dangerous time when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Lamps weren't just practical illumination, they were spiritual beacons that helped keep malevolent forces at bay. The oil used in these lamps was often blessed, and the wicks were sometimes braided with protective fibers. The Greeks understood that they lived in a world layered with invisible influences, where every action carried potential spiritual consequences. This wasn't primitive thinking, it was sophisticated risk management for a complex supernatural environment. They had identified specific threats, developed targeted countermeasures, and created social systems that helped everyone navigate the dangerous waters of daily existence. Children learned these protective behaviors as naturally as they learned to speak. By the time they reached adulthood, spitting away evil, wearing protective amulets, and leaving offerings for household spirits were as automatic as breathing. These weren't burdensome superstitions imposed by ignorant tradition. They were practical life skills passed down through generations of experience. The sophistication of Greek supernatural beliefs becomes even more apparent when we examine their approach to dreams and omens. Dreams weren't random neural activity during sleep. They were direct communications from the divine realm that required careful interpretation and appropriate response. But not all dreams were significant, and learning to distinguish between meaningful visions and ordinary mental processing was a crucial skill. Prophetic dreams typically came during specific phases of the moon, often in sacred locations or after particular rituals. The content mattered less than the emotional tone and symbolic imagery. A dream of clear water might indicate coming good fortune, while murky or turbulent water suggested trouble ahead. Animals in dreams carried their own meanings, with owls representing wisdom or warnings from Athena, while ravens might indicate messages from Apollo or the approach of death. But even ordinary dreams required spiritual attention. Upon waking, Greeks would perform brief purification rituals, washing their hands and face while whispering prayers to Morpheus, the god of dreams, asking for protection from any negative influences that might have entered their minds during sleep. Water used for this morning cleansing was often mixed with salt or herbs to enhance its protective properties. Daytime omens were equally important and far more frequent. The flight patterns of birds carried constant messages for those who knew how to read them. A hawk circling to the right indicated divine approval for planned actions, while leftward circles suggested caution or delay. Crows gathering in unusual numbers might warn of coming conflict, while doves appearing near the home indicated periods of peace and prosperity. The behavior of domestic animals provided another constant stream of supernatural intelligence. Dogs howling at night might indicate the presence of spirits or warn of coming illness. Cats acting strangely often meant changes in household fortune, while horses refusing to enter certain areas might indicate spiritual contamination that required cleansing rituals. Even everyday objects could become conduits for divine communication. Pottery cracking without obvious cause might indicate supernatural displeasure, while wine turning unexpectedly sour could warn of betrayal or deception. Lamps flickering in still air often meant spirits were present, while doors opening or closing on their own required immediate protective measures. The Greeks developed elaborate systems for responding to these omens, with different rituals prescribed for different types of warnings. Some required immediate action, others called for patient observation, and a few demanded complete avoidance of certain activities until the spiritual danger had passed. Priests and oracle specialists made their living interpreting complex omens, but ordinary citizens were expected to recognize and respond to basic supernatural communications. This constant attention to spiritual signals created a society that was hyper-aware of subtle environmental changes and potential threats. While modern people might dismiss such behaviors as neurotic superstition, the Greeks would argue that their careful attention to supernatural warnings helped them avoid disasters and maintain harmony with forces beyond human control. The religious calendar itself was structured around supernatural vulnerabilities and protective opportunities. Certain days were considered inherently dangerous, when the normal barriers between worlds grew thin and malevolent forces could more easily influence mortal affairs. During these periods, Greeks avoided major decisions, postponed important journeys, and increased their protective rituals. The new moon was particularly treacherous, a time when darkness provided cover for spiritual mischief, and divine judgment might fall more heavily on human transgressions. Business was conducted cautiously during these periods. Marriages were postponed, and children were kept close to home with extra protective amulets. Conversely, certain days offered enhanced spiritual protection and favorable conditions for important undertakings. Religious festivals created bubbles of divine blessing, where normal supernatural threats were temporarily reduced. Weddings, business partnerships, and major journeys were timed to coincide with these spiritually advantageous periods. The festival of Anthesteria, dedicated to Dionysus and the spirits of the dead, represented the most dangerous time of the entire year. For 3 days, the boundaries between life and death essentially disappeared, allowing deceased ancestors to return and interact with the living. While this offered opportunities for communication with beloved family members who had passed on, it also opened the door for malevolent spirits with unfinished business. During Anthesteria, every household became a fortress of spiritual protection. Doors and windows were marked with protective symbols, extra offerings were left for household spirits, and family members carried their most powerful amulets. Children were kept indoors after sunset, and adults moved through the streets in groups, never travelling alone through the supernatural chaos that filled the air. Yet even during this most dangerous festival, the Greeks didn't cower in terror. They had developed sophisticated protocols for managing supernatural risks while still honouring their obligations to the dead. Special foods were prepared for returning spirits, specific rooms were designated for ancestral visits, and elaborate rituals ensured that when the festival ended, all visiting spirits would return peacefully to the underworld. This balance between spiritual caution and practical living exemplified the Greek approach to superstition. They weren't paralyzed by supernatural fears, but they refused to ignore spiritual realities in favor of purely material concerns. Their superstitions weren't random anxieties, but carefully developed systems for managing the invisible forces that shaped their world. The influence of these beliefs extended into every aspect of Greek culture, from the great philosophical schools to the smallest household decisions. Even the most rational thinkers of the ancient world, men like Socrates and Plato, incorporated supernatural awareness into their daily routines. Socrates himself claimed to be guided by a divine voice that warned him away from harmful actions, and Plato's academy included instruction in proper spiritual protocols alongside mathematics and rhetoric. This integration of supernatural consciousness with intellectual achievement created a unique cultural synthesis. The Greeks didn't see superstition and reason as opposing forces, but as complementary tools for understanding and navigating a complex world. Their spitting rituals and protective amulets coexisted comfortably with their groundbreaking work in geometry, astronomy, and natural philosophy. The practical benefits of this worldview extended beyond mere psychological comfort. The constant attention to environmental signs and social dynamics that superstitious practices required actually enhanced observational skills and social awareness. People who watch carefully for supernatural omens also notice subtle changes in weather patterns, animal behavior, and human relationships that might indicate practical opportunities or threats. The emphasis on protective rituals and community spiritual practices also strengthened social bonds and mutual support systems. Neighbours who shared supernatural concerns looked out for each other's spiritual welfare, creating networks of care that extended beyond mere economic or political relationships. The old woman who reminded young mothers about protective amulets for their children was performing a valuable social service, maintaining community knowledge and mutual protection. Even the seemingly irrational fear of the evil eye served important social functions. The requirement for protective responses to compliments created a culture where praise was given thoughtfully and received with appropriate humility. This reduced social tensions around inequality and success, while encouraging mutual support rather than competitive envy. The Greek approach to supernatural protection also fostered a sophisticated understanding of psychological states and their effects on physical health and social relationships. While they attributed these influences to spiritual forces rather than neurochemical processes, their practical responses often achieved similar benefits to modern stress management and social support techniques. The spitting rituals, protective amulets, and household offerings provided regular opportunities for mindful attention to spiritual and emotional states. The requirement to pause and perform protective gestures created moments of reflection and intentional action that interrupted automatic behavioral patterns and encouraged conscious awareness of one's environment and relationships. The seasonal timing of spiritual practices aligned human behavior with natural cycles in ways that supported both individual well-being and community cohesion. The recognition of particularly dangerous or beneficial periods encouraged people to adjust their activities according to both supernatural beliefs and practical environmental conditions. As we observe these ancient Greek superstitions from our modern perspective, it's tempting to dismiss them as quaint relics of a less enlightened age. Yet many of our contemporary behaviors reveal remarkably similar underlying concerns. We knock on wood, throw salt over our shoulders, avoid walking under ladders, and carry lucky objects, often without conscious awareness of the supernatural beliefs that originally motivated these actions. Our modern anxiety about jinxing success by speaking too confidently about future plans echoes the Greek fear of attracting divine jealousy through excessive pride. Our tendency to touch protective objects during stressful moments mirrors their use of amulets and ritual gestures. Our superstitions around numbers, colours, and timing reflect the same human need to feel some measure of control over unpredictable forces. The difference lies not in the presence or absence of supernatural thinking, but in our level of conscious engagement with these beliefs and practices. The ancient Greeks developed sophisticated, culturally integrated systems for managing supernatural concerns, while we often maintain fragmented, half-conscious superstitious behaviors that we might even ridicule in ourselves or others. Perhaps there's something to be learned from the Greek approach to superstition, not necessarily about the reality of evil eyes or wandering spirits, but about the value of mindful attention to the subtle forces that influence our daily lives. Their practices encouraged careful observation, thoughtful response to environmental changes, mutual care and protection, and conscious engagement with the mysteries that surround human existence. In our rush to embrace purely rational, scientific approaches to life, we may have lost some valuable wisdom about the importance of ritual, community spiritual practices, and respectful attention to forces beyond our immediate control or understanding. The ancient Greeks, for all their spitting and amulet wearing, managed to create one of the most intellectually and culturally sophisticated civilizations in human history. Their superstitions didn't prevent them from developing democracy, philosophy, mathematics, and drama. Instead, these practices seem to provide a stable foundation of spiritual security that freed them to explore bold new ideas and take creative risks in other areas of life. They could question the nature of reality because they felt protected by their spiritual practices. They could experiment with new forms of government because their supernatural safeguards provided psychological stability. The 3 ritual spits that protected them from evil also somehow protected their capacity for intellectual courage and cultural innovation. The blue-eyed amulets that shielded their children from jealous spirits also shielded their civilization's capacity to produce lasting beauty and wisdom. As we drift towards sleep in our modern world, surrounded by our own subtle superstitions and protective rituals, perhaps we can appreciate the ancient Greeks not as primitive believers in nonsensical magic, but as sophisticated practitioners of human wisdom who understood something important about the relationship between spiritual security and intellectual freedom, between protective traditions and creative courage, between the seen and unseen forces that shape our daily lives. Their spitting and charms and careful attention to invisible influences created space for philosophy and democracy and theatrical brilliance to flourish. In their strange balance of supernatural caution and intellectual boldness, they found a way to honor both the mysteries they couldn't explain and the truths they could discover, both the forces they couldn't control and the ideas they could explore. And in that balance, whispered across centuries through the rustle of olive leaves and the echo of ancient prayers, there might still be wisdom for those willing to listen, to observe, and perhaps, when the moment calls for it, to spit 3 times into the darkness and trust that some protections transcend understanding. As we delve deeper into the supernatural world of ancient Greece, we find ourselves confronting beliefs that seem to contradict everything we know about their rational, philosophical reputation. Yes, these were the people who gave us Socrates and Aristotle, but they were also the people who believed that certain numbers could literally kill you, that mirrors were dangerous portals to other realms, and that sneezing at the wrong moment could doom your entire family line. The Greeks lived in a world where the supernatural wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. Every threshold crossed, every meal eaten, every word spoken carried potential spiritual consequences. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was sophisticated risk management in a universe they believed was actively watching, judging, and responding to human behavior. Consider the Greek obsession with cleanliness, but not the kind we think of today. To the Greeks, purity wasn't about hygiene, it was about spiritual contamination. The concept of miasma, a kind of metaphysical pollution, governed everything from childbirth to death rituals. If you touched a corpse, entered a house where someone had died, or even walked past certain graves, you carried invisible spiritual dirt that could anger the gods and bring misfortune to your family, your city, your crops. The purification rituals were elaborate and non-negotiable. You couldn't just wash your hands and move on. Specific herbs had to be burned, certain prayers recited, particular offerings made. Some contamination required you to leave the city entirely until the pollution had lifted. Imagine modern life if touching anything associated with death meant you had to leave town for a month and perform complex ceremonies before you could return to work. But miasma wasn't just about death. Sexual activity, childbirth, even certain types of dreams could leave you spiritually unclean. Greek women after giving birth were considered so contaminated that they couldn't enter temples, participate in festivals, or sometimes even touch their own families until elaborate purification rites were completed. This wasn't misogyny disguised as religion, though it certainly had that effect. The Greeks genuinely believed that spiritual pollution was contagious and dangerous, like a virus that could spread through communities and bring divine wrath upon everyone. The fear of miasma shaped Greek architecture. Houses were built with specific orientations to prevent spiritual contamination from flowing in through doorways. Temples had complex entrance rituals designed to ensure that only the spiritually clean could approach the gods. Even the famous Greek symposiums, those philosophical drinking parties we romanticize today, began with purification ceremonies to cleanse the space and the participants. Water played a crucial role in these beliefs, but not any water. The Greeks distinguished between different types of water for spiritual purposes. Running water from a spring could cleanse certain types of contamination, but stagnant water might make it worse. Seawater was particularly powerful for purification, which is why many rituals took place near the coast. But rainwater collected during certain moon phases, that was reserved for the most serious spiritual emergencies. The Greeks also believed in spiritual pollution by association. If your neighbor was contaminated and you shared a meal with them, you might absorb their miasma, If you borrowed tools from someone who was spiritually unclean, the contamination could transfer to you. This created complex social hierarchies around purity, where people constantly monitored not just their own spiritual state, but that of everyone around them. Dreams were another source of supernatural anxiety that consumed Greek daily life. Unlike modern interpretations that focus on psychology, the Greeks believed dreams were direct communications from gods, spirits, or the dead. A bad dream wasn't something you forgot over morning coffee. It was a warning that required immediate action. Dream interpretation was a professional skill, with specialists who could decode divine messages and prescribe the appropriate responses. Certain dreams were considered so ominous that they could halt major life decisions. If you dreamed of owls before a wedding, the marriage might be postponed. If you saw dead relatives in your sleep, you might need to perform elaborate funeral rites, even if those relatives had been buried years earlier. Some dreams required immediate sacrifices. Others demanded that you change your name or move to a different city. The Greeks categorized dreams into different types based on their spiritual significance. Divine dreams came directly from gods and were usually clear in their meaning. Demonic dreams were sent by malevolent spirits and were designed to mislead or terrify. Prophetic dreams showed future events, but were often symbolic and required skilled interpretation. And then there were pollution dreams, which indicated that you had somehow been spiritually contaminated and needed purification. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Greek dream superstition was their belief in dream sharing. If you had a particularly vivid or disturbing dream, you might need to tell it to specific people in a specific order to prevent its negative effects from manifesting. Some dreams were considered so powerful that speaking them aloud could make them come true, while others would only lose their power if they were shared with the right person before sunrise. Sleep itself was fraught with supernatural dangers. The Greeks believed that during sleep, your soul partially left your body, making you vulnerable to spiritual attack. Certain sleeping positions were thought to invite demonic possession. Sleeping with your head pointing north could allow evil spirits to enter through the crown of your skull. Sleeping near mirrors was dangerous because your soul might get trapped in the reflection and be unable to return to your body. The concept of the evil eye in Greek culture went far beyond casual superstition. It was a comprehensive system of spiritual self-defense that influenced everything from fashion to architecture. The Greeks believed that certain people possessed the ability to cause harm simply by looking at someone or something with envy, anger, or even excessive admiration. This wasn't intentional malice in most cases. The evil eye could be cast accidentally by someone who was naturally envious or who had been cursed themselves. Children were considered especially vulnerable to the evil eye, which is why Greek parents developed elaborate protection strategies. Babies were rarely taken out in public without amulets, and when they were displayed to visitors, specific rituals had to be performed. Complimenting a child too enthusiastically was actually considered dangerous. Parents would quickly make protective gestures or recite counterspells if someone praised their child's beauty or health too effusively. The physical symptoms of evil eye affliction were taken very seriously. Sudden illness, unexplained accidents, crop failures, or even minor inconveniences like spilling wine or tripping could all be attributed to someone's envious gaze. Greek physicians were trained to distinguish between natural ailments and those caused by supernatural means, and treatment often involved spiritual healing alongside medical intervention. Protection against the evil eye required constant vigilance. The Greeks wore specific amulets, usually blue beads or painted eyes, that were believed to reflect malevolent gazes back to their source. Houses were decorated with protective symbols carved into door frames or painted on walls. Even livestock were adorned with charms to prevent envious neighbors from causing their milk to dry up or their fertility to diminish. But the most fascinating aspect of Greek evil eye beliefs was their social function. In a society where inequality was stark and envy was common, the fear of casting or receiving the evil eye actually encouraged more egalitarian behavior. Wealthy Greeks would often downplay their prosperity to avoid attracting envious gazes. Public displays of excessive wealth or happiness were considered not just tasteless, but genuinely dangerous. The Greeks developed sophisticated countermeasures for when evil eye attacks occurred. These ranged from simple protective gestures like spitting 3 times or making the sign of the phallus, to complex rituals involving multiple participants, special oils, and elaborate incantations. Some counterspells were designed to send the evil eye back to its source, creating a kind of spiritual warfare where communities could be divided by invisible battles of malevolent gazing. Numbers held a power in Greek society that went far beyond mathematics. Certain numbers were considered so unlucky that they could bring disaster simply by being spoken aloud or written down. The number 13 was feared, but so were 4, 9, and any number that added up to these when its digits were combined. Greeks would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid these numbers in addresses, in the timing of important events, and even in the number of guests at dinner parties. But lucky numbers required their own careful handling. 7 was powerful and protective, but using it incorrectly could backfire. Performing an action 7 times might bring good fortune, but stopping at 6 repetitions could invite bad luck. 3 was sacred to many gods, but it had to be used in the right context. Speaking someone's name 3 times could summon them, but it could also curse them if done with the wrong intentions. The Greeks believed that numbers had personalities and relationships with each other. Some numbers were naturally hostile and would create conflict if used together. Others were harmonious and would amplify each other's power. This wasn't abstract philosophy. It was practical knowledge that influenced everything from architecture to poetry to military strategy. Greek builders incorporated numerical superstitions into their work. Temples were designed with specific numbers of columns, steps, and decorative elements to ensure divine favor. Houses were built with room counts that would bring prosperity and protection to their inhabitants. Even city planning took numerical superstitions into account, with streets and districts arranged according to spiritually significant patterns. The timing of events was equally important. Greeks believed that certain days of the month were cursed, and that beginning any important undertaking during these periods would result in failure or worse. Wedding dates were chosen not just for convenience, but for numerical significance. Battles were sometimes delayed or hastened based on calendar superstitions. Perhaps most remarkably, the Greeks believed that numbers could influence personality and destiny. Your birth date determined not just your character, but your spiritual vulnerabilities. People born on days associated with unlucky numbers might spend their entire lives performing protective rituals and avoiding situations that would amplify their numerical disadvantages. Greek superstitions around mirrors and reflective surfaces revealed deep anxieties about the nature of identity and the soul. To the Greeks, your reflection wasn't just a visual phenomenon. It was a spiritual double that existed in a liminal space between the physical and supernatural worlds. This other self could be influenced, trapped, or even stolen by malevolent forces, leaving you spiritually diminished or vulnerable to possession. Looking into still water, polished metal, or any reflective surface was considered risky, especially at night or during certain moon phases. Your reflection might be seen by spirits or gods who could use it to gain power over you. Some Greeks covered mirrors during thunderstorms, believing that lightning could strike through reflections and harm the viewer. Others avoided looking at their reflections during times of illness, fearing that seeing themselves weakened might make the condition permanent. The Greeks developed elaborate protocols around mirror use. Certain mirrors were consecrated for religious purposes and could only be used by priests or priestesses. Others were considered cursed and were avoided entirely. When someone died, mirrors in their house were covered to prevent their spirit from becoming trapped in the reflection and haunting the living. But mirrors weren't just sources of danger, they were also tools for divination and protection. Skilled practitioners could use reflective surfaces to communicate with gods, predict the future, or identify sources of spiritual contamination. Mirror scrying required extensive training and protective rituals, as the practitioner was essentially opening doorways between worlds. The fear of having one's reflection stolen or corrupted led to complex social etiquette around reflective surfaces. Greeks would warn each other before looking into the same mirror, perform protective gestures before viewing their reflections, and sometimes even require witnesses when using mirrors for important purposes, like preparing for religious ceremonies or significant life events. Ancient Greek superstitions about food and eating revealed their belief that nourishment was as much spiritual as physical. Every meal was a potential ritual, every bite a communion with forces beyond the material world. The Greeks believed that food could carry spiritual properties based on how it was grown, prepared, and consumed. A single meal prepared incorrectly or eaten at the wrong time could bring misfortune to an entire household. Certain foods were considered inherently dangerous. Beans, for example, were associated with the dead and were forbidden in many religious contexts. The philosopher Pythagoras warned his followers against eating beans, claiming they contained the souls of the deceased. This wasn't metaphorical. Many Greeks genuinely believed that consuming beans could lead to spiritual possession or communication with ghosts. The preparation of food required constant attention to supernatural considerations. Bread had to be kneaded while reciting specific prayers. Wine needed to be mixed with water in precise proportions that honored both Dionysus and local water spirits. Meat from sacrificial animals had to be cooked and served according to elaborate protocols that ensured the gods received their proper portion before humans could eat. Even the act of eating was ritualized. Greeks would pour libations before meals, not just as offerings to the gods, but as protection against spiritual contamination. Certain foods couldn't be eaten together because their spiritual properties were incompatible. Others required specific prayers or gestures to neutralize potential negative effects. The Greeks believed that sharing food created spiritual bonds between people, but these bonds could be dangerous if one party was spiritually contaminated. Eating with someone who carried miasma could transfer their pollution to you. This led to complex social hierarchies around dining, where people's spiritual status determined who they could share meals with. Leftovers presented their own supernatural challenges. Food that had been partially consumed was considered spiritually altered and potentially dangerous. Some leftovers had to be buried rather than eaten. Others required purification rituals before they could be safely consumed. The Greeks believed that leaving food exposed overnight could allow spirits to contaminate it, making it harmful or even deadly to human consumption. Greek superstitions around childbirth and child rearing demonstrated their belief that children existed in a particularly vulnerable state between the physical and spiritual worlds. Newborns were considered especially susceptible to supernatural influences, and protecting them required elaborate precautions that began before birth and continued for years afterward. Pregnant women lived under extensive supernatural restrictions. They couldn't attend funerals, look at certain images, or eat foods that might spiritually contaminate the developing child. Even their dreams were monitored and interpreted by specialists who could identify potential threats to the unborn baby. Expectant mothers wore specific amulets and performed daily protective rituals to shield themselves and their children from malevolent influences. The moment of birth was considered magically charged and dangerous. Midwives were trained not just in medical techniques, but in spiritual protection. They knew which prayers to recite, which herbs to burn, and which symbols to draw to ensure safe delivery and protect the newborn from supernatural attack. The placenta and umbilical cord were disposed of according to strict protocols to prevent them from being used in malevolent magic against the child. Naming a child was a spiritually significant act that could determine the baby's entire destiny. Names had to be chosen based on astrological considerations, family spiritual history, and divine guidance received through dreams or omens. Some names were considered so powerful that speaking them aloud could attract unwanted supernatural attention. Others were believed to provide protection against specific types of spiritual threats. The first few years of a child's life were marked by constant supernatural vigilance. Children wore multiple protective amulets and were rarely left alone, not just for physical safety, but for spiritual protection. Certain activities were forbidden during specific moon phases. Even seemingly innocent games and songs had to be chosen carefully to avoid accidentally invoking dangerous spirits or curses. Greek parents monitored their children for signs of supernatural influence. Unusual behavior, unexplained illnesses, or even exceptional talents could indicate that a child had been touched by gods or spirits. This required immediate consultation with religious specialists who could determine whether the influence was benevolent or malevolent and prescribe appropriate responses. The educational process itself was considered spiritually significant. Children weren't just learning facts and skills, they were being initiated into the complex supernatural landscape of Greek society. They learned to recognize omens, perform protective rituals, and navigate the invisible world of spirits and divine influences that surrounded them every day. What emerges from this deep exploration of Greek superstitions is a picture of a society that was simultaneously rational and magical, philosophical and deeply spiritual. These weren't contradictory aspects of Greek culture. They were complementary systems that worked together to help people navigate an uncertain and potentially dangerous world. The Greeks didn't see superstition as the opposite of reason. They saw it as reason applied to spiritual realities that were just as real and important as physical ones. Their elaborate systems of protective rituals, purification ceremonies, and supernatural protocols weren't signs of primitive thinking. They were sophisticated technologies for managing risks that they believed were genuinely present in their world. These beliefs served multiple functions beyond mere spiritual protection. They created social cohesion by establishing shared frameworks for understanding and responding to uncertainty. They provided psychological comfort in a world where disease, death, and disaster could strike without warning. They offered a sense of agency and control in situations that were otherwise completely beyond human influence. The Greek approach to superstition also demonstrated remarkable intellectual sophistication. Their systems were internally consistent, logically structured, and adaptable to new circumstances. They developed detailed taxonomies of supernatural threats, comprehensive protocols for spiritual protection, and specialized roles for managing community spiritual health. Perhaps most importantly, Greek superstitions revealed their deep understanding of the psychological and social dimensions of belief. They recognized that spiritual practices needed to address not just individual fears and anxieties, but collective concerns about social harmony, moral behavior, and community survival. The legacy of Greek superstitions extended far beyond their own culture. Many of their beliefs about the evil eye, spiritual contamination, and supernatural protection spread throughout the Mediterranean world and continue to influence folk practices today. Their integration of spiritual and rational thinking provided a model for how sophisticated societies could maintain both scientific inquiry and meaningful spiritual practice. In examining these ancient Greek superstitions, we see not a primitive people clinging to irrational fears, but a complex civilization that developed elaborate systems for managing the full spectrum of human experience, both visible and invisible, rational and mysterious. Their superstitions weren't obstacles to their philosophical and scientific achievements. They were part of the same intellectual framework that allowed them to explore every aspect of reality with curiosity, rigor, and profound respect for the unknown. The Greeks understood something that modern rationalism sometimes forgets: that human beings need frameworks for dealing with uncertainty, systems for managing anxiety about forces beyond their control, and communities of shared meaning that can provide support during times of crisis. Their superstitions, however strange they may seem to us today, served these essential human needs while still leaving room for the rational inquiry and philosophical exploration that we remember them for. This balance between reason and wonder, between scientific investigation and spiritual practice, between individual achievement and community protection, may be one of the most valuable lessons we can learn from ancient Greek superstitions. They remind us that wisdom isn't just about accumulating knowledge. It's about developing comprehensive systems for living well in a world that remains, despite all our advances, fundamentally mysterious and beyond our complete understanding or control. So, from the ancient Babylonians tracking celestial patterns to predict floods, to Egyptian priests watching Sirius rise to time the Nile's inundation, to Chinese scholars interpreting cloud formations as messages from heaven, we've seen how humanity has always sought to read the sky like a sacred text. These weren't just primitive attempts at forecasting. They were sophisticated systems built on generations of careful observation, blending science with spirituality, astronomy with agriculture. While modern meteorology gives us satellite imagery and computer models, perhaps we've lost something our ancestors understood, that weather isn't just data to be consumed, but a conversation with the natural world that requires patience, respect, and the wisdom to listen. Sweet dreams, and may your own forecasts always prove favorable.